The millionaire smirked when the housekeeper said she was quitting. It wasn't a loud laugh or anything dramatic. It was that brief, automatic smile people wear when they don't believe a decision deserves to be taken seriously, especially when it comes from someone they don't consider important. Jonathan Miller leaned back in his leather chair, folding his arms as he studied the woman standing in front of him, the way someone looks at an issue they already consider resolved. His office sat on the top floor of a glass tower in downtown Manhattan, surrounded by skyscrapers that reflected power, money, and emotional distance. Everything in that room existed to remind people who was in charge. "You picked a terrible moment to play independent," he said calmly, his voice controlled and sharp. "If you hadn't resigned today, I would have let you go soon anyway." Claire Whitman remained standing, her hands loosely clasped in front of her, holding her posture while every word tried to push her into a smaller place. Her plain uniform clashed with the polished office, and Jonathan noticed it with quiet satisfaction. "Let's be honest," he went on. "You're useful for basic tasks, nothing more. Slow, predictable, and completely replaceable. The only reason you were still here was convenience, and even that stopped being worth it." He stood up, walked toward the desk, and rested his hands on the cold glass surface, closing the distance without raising his voice. "Out there, you're nobody," he said flatly. "In here, at least, you knew how to follow orders. So quitting is actually a favor. I would have done it for you within weeks." Jonathan turned his back on her and shifted his attention to the computer, as if the conversation no longer mattered. "Leave your badge at the front desk," he added. "And don't waste time thinking anyone's going to miss you." Claire didn't reply. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. She simply took a slow breath and walked out. The hallway felt narrower than before, the sound of her footsteps muted by the steady hum of the building continuing its routine as if nothing had happened. As she stepped through the side exit, a cold gust of air brushed her face, bringing a quiet sense of relief she hadn't expected so soon. Almost instinctively, Jonathan walked toward the glass wall. He wanted to see the obvious ending. He expected hesitation. A pause. Maybe her scanning the street for a cab. Maybe even a backward glance. None of that happened. Claire walked straight toward the restricted area behind the building. Security opened the gate without a single question. On the private tarmac beyond it sat a sleek white executive jet, elegant, understated, and far too quiet for a place like that. Jonathan felt his stomach tighten. He recognized the aircraft immediately. Not out of vanity, but experience. He knew the price. He knew the tier. And with growing discomfort, he knew that even he couldn't realistically afford, let alone maintain, something like that. Claire approached the jet without hesitation. A uniformed pilot waited at the bottom of the stairs, greeting her with direct, effortless respect, as if this scene were part of a long-established routine. She climbed the steps calmly. Jonathan stood frozen, trying to reconcile the words he had just thrown at her. Useless, disposable, nobody, with the impossible image unfolding in front of him. The jet door closed. The engines powered up, and the sound cut through the office glass like a delayed. The aircraft began to move with complete ease, no rush, no uncertainty. Inside the jet, Claire took a seat by the window. There was no triumph on her face, no urge to prove anything. Only the steady certainty that she no longer needed to shrink in order to exist. Jonathan tried to keep smiling. He couldn't. For the first time, he realized that the humiliation he had delivered didn't make her smaller. It only exposed how little he ever understood about the person who had truly been working for him. And as the jet disappeared into the sky, the comfortable story he had relied on for years began to fall apart. Claire pressed her palms against the armrests, feeling the vibration travel through her body as the jet climbed higher. For years, she had learned how to take up less space, how to choose her words carefully, how to control every gesture, how to exist without drawing attention. Now, Everything was moving too fast for that older version of herself to keep up. The aircraft leveled out. The city fell away beneath the clouds, suddenly looking too organized, too predictable, as if it had never held the power it seemed to carry just minutes earlier. Inside, the cabin was quiet and efficient, understated rather than luxurious. Nothing suggested impulse. Everything spoke of planning. A flight attendant approached and offered water. Claire accepted with a small nod. The cold glass in her hands grounded her, giving weight to a moment that still felt unreal. She drank slowly, focusing on staying present. Her phone vibrated. She recognized the type of call before answering. No name appeared on the screen, but none was needed. She picked up. "You're airborne," the voice on the other end said, calm and unsurprised. "Yes. The flight is proceeding as scheduled. No changes." Claire paused before asking, her breath steady. And after, there was a brief, deliberate silence. "After landing, the choice is still yours." The call ended without a goodbye. Claire sat there for several seconds, phone still in her hand, letting the weight of that sentence settle in. For a long time, making decisions had never truly been allowed. There was always someone setting limits, approving, correcting. Now, the absence of that external control felt both freeing and unsettling. The jet continued smoothly through the sky. Nothing about it suggested urgency. This wasn't a reckless response to what had happened in the office. It was something drawn up in advance, shaped with intention and precision. Her thoughts drifted back over the past few years, not with nostalgia, but with clarity. Conversations that stopped when she entered a room. Instructions given without explanation. Information passing through her hands without ever carrying her name. Jonathan believed she was disposable because he mistook silence for incompetence. What he never noticed was that Claire was always watching. Who needed to speak loudly to be heard. Who overpromised to maintain control. Who relied on hierarchy because real authority didn't hold. The aircraft adjusted its course slightly. The change in sound was almost imperceptible. Claire felt a quick tightening in her stomach. It wasn't fear. It was anticipation. The landing took place at a private airport, far from commercial routes, far from lines, announcements, and curious eyes. The jet slowed until it came to a complete stop. The silence inside was unlike anything Claire had known before. There was no submission in it. Only expectation. She stayed seated for a moment after the engines shut down, breathing deeply, allowing her body to catch up. When she stood, her legs felt stiff, as if testing unfamiliar ground. She descended the stairs calmly. The night air was colder, drier. A man waited several feet away, posture straight, clothing simple, eyes attentive. He didn't look interested in impressing anyone. "Claire Whitman," he said, confirming rather than asking. "That's me. The car is ready." The drive unfolded in silence. The vehicle avoided brightly lit avenues, moving through quieter streets that barely registered on a map. The city appeared in fragments, dark storefronts, lonely traffic lights, long shadows stretching across the pavement. Claire rested her head briefly against the seat. Jonathan's voice returned uninvited. "You're nobody." The words no longer hurt the way they once did, but they still served as a clear reminder of what she would never accept again. The car stopped in front of an unmarked building, discreet and unassuming. Inside, everything was functional, almost severe. Nothing was designed to impress. Everything existed to work. Claire was led into a simple room and asked to wait. She sat, observing quietly. Time stretched into minutes that seemed to measure something intangible. Her body stayed alert, but there was no panic. The door opened. A woman stepped inside. Effortlessly elegant, confident posture, direct gaze. She didn't smile. She studied Claire for a moment before speaking. "You left your job today." "I did. And boarded a jet your former employer couldn't afford." Claire met her eyes. "Yes." The woman walked a few steps across the room. "You understand what that triggers." "I do. People don't handle losing control well." Claire took a steady breath. "I know. And you came anyway." "I did." The silence that followed was deliberate, evaluative. "Then we need to be clear about something," the woman said. "From this point on, nothing will be comfortable. This isn't about revenge. It's about structure. And structure comes at a cost." Claire felt the weight of that reality settle in her chest. "I can carry it," she said. The woman nodded, without enthusiasm. "We'll see." Nothing else was explained. Hours later, Claire checked into a modest hotel. The room was quiet, impersonal, almost neutral. She sat on the bed without turning on the lights. The world she knew had been broken open. The new one offered no guarantees yet. Elsewhere in the city, Jonathan Miller ended his day the same way he always had. He told the story of her resignation as if it were trivial, almost amusing, repeating certain lines with a laugh, convinced everything was still under control. But small cracks began to appear. A call that went unanswered. A response delayed. A strange silence where access had once been immediate. Nothing obvious. Not yet. Back in the room, Claire pulled the curtain aside and looked out at the city. The lights spread below like a map she didn't fully know how to read yet. There was no sense of victory there. Only movement. She took a deep breath. The routine had been broken. The point of no return had been crossed. And whatever came next would demand more than courage. If this story is pulling you in so far, subscribe to the channel. What comes next is even more intense. Claire Whitman woke up before the alarm, carrying that uneasy feeling that comes from sleeping too little, not from lack of rest, but from thinking too much. The hotel room remained silent, overly neat, almost sterile, as if it had been designed to leave no trace of whoever stayed there. For a few moments, she lay still, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out where this new chapter of her life actually began, since nothing around her showed any visible sign of change. She got up slowly, walked to the window, and pulled the curtain just enough to let the morning light in. The city stretched below with its usual urgency. People rushing, cars stopping at traffic lights, buildings reflecting a routine completely unaware of what had shifted the day before. Claire took a deep breath and realized that even though everything looked the same, something inside her no longer fit where it used to. She dressed in simple, comfortable clothes, making no effort to fit into any specific role. She no longer needed to appear smaller to survive, but she also felt no urge to prove anything. The absence of that pressure felt strange, almost unsettling. Her phone buzzed as soon as she finished getting ready. A short, straightforward message appeared, with no unnecessary explanation. "Car arriving in 10 minutes. Bring only what you need." Claire replied with a simple, "Okay," and headed downstairs. The car waited discreetly in front of the hotel. The driver opened the door, greeted her with a brief nod, and drove off without initiating conversation. The route avoided main roads, bypassed busy avenues, and cut through less obvious parts of the city. Claire watched in silence, absorbing details as if she were relearning how to see the world without the filter of submission. They arrived at an unmarked warehouse, set away from downtown, with no signage and no visible identification. The gate opened after a few seconds, allowing the car inside before closing again. The interior was wide and brightly lit with almost clinical white light, desks arranged for function rather than comfort, screens glowing, people moving with absolute focus, no side conversations, no wasted gestures. As Claire stepped out, the atmosphere weighed on her immediately. There was no overt tension, but everything demanded attention. The woman who had spoken to her the night before emerged from a side corridor, walking with firm steps, her expression neutral, without any attempt at warmth. "Today, you observe," she said plainly. "No interference. No opinions. No trying to get ahead. Just watch." Claire nodded. She was guided to a side desk and handed a tablet and a headset. On the screen, charts updated in real time, maps, figures, flows moving with unsettling precision. Through the headset, voices came one after another, always concise, always direct, discussing decisions that never appeared in public reports or news headlines. She heard the names of companies she recognized, structures she had seen up close, not as a decision-maker, but as someone who had always been too close to be uninformed and too distant to receive credit. The realization tightened her chest quietly. Hours passed without anyone speaking to her again. Claire stayed alert, absorbing patterns, understanding dynamics, noticing something Jonathan had never grasped. This world didn't run on ego or visibility. It operated on accuracy, restraint, and continuity. At one point, she noticed that certain decisions directly affected businesses connected to Jonathan. Not aggressively. Not as a direct strike. More like a cold, technical redirection, almost elegant. Nothing felt personal, which made it even more unsettling. During a brief break, Claire stepped outside into an open area behind the warehouse. The air felt heavy, the sky covered with low clouds. She rested her arms on a metal railing and looked at the empty street beyond the high wall. Without effort, she pictured Jonathan sitting in his office, repeating stories to himself, holding on to laughter that was beginning to lose its confidence. Her phone vibrated again. This time, the number appeared on the screen. Claire waited a few seconds before answering. "Where are you?" Jonathan's voice came through, tense, stripped of its usual control. "Busy," she replied calmly. "What you're doing isn't smart," he said too quickly. "You don't understand the kind of people you're dealing with." Claire took a steady breath before responding. "Smart was everything you never noticed," she said, ending the call without waiting for a reply. Her heart was beating faster now, not from fear, but from the clear confirmation that he was already feeling the loss of control. That call wasn't curiosity. It was reaction. When she returned inside, she noticed a few glances directed her way, not with judgment, but with renewed attention. The woman approached her again. "He's figured it out," she remarked, as if confirming expected data. "Figured out what?" Claire asked. "That you weren't where he thought you were." Nothing else needed to be said. The rest of the day brought new tests. Not announced. Not explicit. An indirect proposal here, a vague invitation there, intermediaries quietly trying to measure how far she would go. Claire responded the way she had learned over the years, listening more than speaking, saying only what was necessary, refusing to fill silences that didn't belong to her. In one of those conversations, she clearly saw the trap. A man spoke too much, offered vague assurances, tried to provoke an emotional reaction he could later use. Claire kept her gaze steady and her posture neutral, letting the discomfort grow on the other side of the table. People used to leading don't handle it well when there's no mirror. When she left that room, she felt the true weight of the path she was taking. There was no glamour. No easy promises. Only responsibility, and it demanded constant presence. At the end of the day, a short message appeared on her tablet. "You passed." Nothing more. On the drive back to the hotel, traffic came to a standstill for a few minutes. Claire watched people walking along the sidewalk, unaware of the tension building inside her. For the first time, she understood that this wasn't about revenge, nor about proving anything to Jonathan. It was about stepping into a space that had always existed, one she had learned to avoid herself. That night, alone in the quiet room, she tried to relax, but her mind kept connecting dots, revisiting looks, reinterpreting old remarks. Things Jonathan had said in the past now appeared in a different light. Decisions she had made on her own, finances she had organized without drawing attention, documents she had signed with a confidence that never matched the image he held of her. Everything had always been there. He simply never chose to see it. Before falling asleep, her phone buzzed once more. Claire glanced at the screen and didn't answer, not out of fear, but out of choice. Some responses no longer needed to be given. She sat on the edge of the bed, took a deep breath, and faced her reflection in the dark screen of the turned-off television. Something was moving now, growing beyond the reach of someone who had always believed he controlled everything. And she knew, with an almost uncomfortable clarity, that this was still only the beginning. And you, what would you do in her place? Have you ever realized too late that you were being underestimated? Tell us in the comments. I really want to read them. The next day, the conference room was full, but it lacked the usual noise that comes with high-level meetings. Conversations stayed low and controlled, as if everyone understood that authority didn't require raised voices. Floor-to-ceiling glass surrounded the space, the city visible in the background, distant and almost irrelevant compared to what was unfolding inside. Jonathan Miller walked in with the confidence of someone who still believed he belonged there. He adjusted his suit jacket, nodded to a few familiar faces, and headed toward the central table, fully expecting the usual scene, one where his name still carried weight. That was when he saw Claire Whitman. She was already seated, not off to the side, not as an assistant, not waiting for permission to speak. She sat at the main table, a tablet in front of her, speaking quietly with a man Jonathan recognized instantly, not from personal connection, but from reputation alone. A billionaire known for making decisions without announcements, for shifting entire industries without needing attention. Jonathan's body reacted before his mind could catch up. A sharp tightening in his stomach, followed by a rushed attempt to explain the scene away. Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe she was there by chance. Maybe she was accompanying someone. None of those explanations survived more than a few seconds. Claire looked up and noticed him. There was no surprise in her expression, no visible tension, just a calm awareness of exactly where she stood. "What is she doing here?" Jonathan asked, not realizing his voice had come out louder than intended. A few heads turned, not with curiosity, but with quiet discomfort, as if the question itself didn't belong in that room anymore. The man beside Claire stood up calmly. "She's exactly where she needs to be," he said, his voice steady. "Let's begin the meeting." Jonathan forced himself to recover. "I wasn't informed of any changes," he said, tightening his tone. "Especially not her involvement." The man studied him for a moment longer than necessary before responding. "You were informed of what you needed to know. Not everything." The meeting began. Charts appeared on the screens. Numbers shifted. Investment routes were rearranged. Jonathan recognized contracts, structures, and strategies he had once considered nearly guaranteed. With each new slide, another piece of the certainty he'd built over the years quietly unraveled. Methodically, precisely. "This goes through my company," Jonathan interrupted, trying to regain control. "These figures can't be discussed like this." "They used to," the man replied evenly. The word landed hard. Jonathan turned toward Claire. "You're involved in this?" he asked. "I am," she answered, without hesitation. "Since when?" Claire took a breath, keeping her voice steady. "Since the moment you decided I didn't need to understand anything happening around you." The silence that followed was uncomfortable. No one rushed to fill it. There was no room for performance. Jonathan let out a short, nervous laugh. "This is some kind of stunt," he said. "You honestly think you belong at this level?" The man beside Claire answered before she had to. "She doesn't think," he said calmly. "She decides." Jonathan frowned. "What does that mean?" The man turned slightly toward Claire, then spoke clearly enough for everyone in the room to hear. After the meeting, we need to finalize the remaining details of our marriage. The legal timeline is already in motion. The word echoed across the room. Marriage. Jonathan froze. He stared at Claire as if seeing her for the first time, trying to process what he'd just heard. "You're marrying him?" he asked, his voice breaking slightly. "I am," Claire replied, without pause. There were no explanations. No justifications. None were needed. Just minutes earlier, Jonathan had called her useless, disposable, nobody. Now she was about to become the wife of one of the most powerful men in the room, while actively participating in decisions that were dismantling his own business interests. The meeting continued as if Jonathan were no longer essential. Claire made precise observations, adjusted projections, corrected assumptions. She spoke rarely, but every word carried weight. The man beside her listened, nodded, and took notes. Jonathan sat in silence, feeling something break beyond repair. It wasn't only the financial loss beginning to take shape. It was the clear realization that he had never truly been in control, only comfortable, supported by arrogance. When the meeting ended, Claire gathered her documents and stood. The man placed a hand on her back with effortless familiarity. Before leaving, she turned to Jonathan one last time. "When I quit," she said calmly, "you laughed and told me I was nobody." She paused briefly. "Today, you're finally seeing who I've always been. You just never chose to look." Claire walked out without turning back. Jonathan remained seated, surrounded by people who now avoided his gaze. The world didn't collapse with noise or drama. It simply shifted its center. If this turn caught you off guard, like the video, it helps us keep telling stories like this. Claire Whitman left the room without rushing, not out of hesitation, but because her body was only now beginning to register the full weight of what had just happened. The long corridor seemed to absorb the sound of her footsteps, as if the building itself were designed to slow anyone walking through it after a definitive turning point. The meeting was over, the decisions had been recorded, yet her mind lingered at the table, caught on diverted glances and the precise moment the word marriage shifted everything out of place. Outside, the air was colder than she expected, heavy with moisture, and a light drizzle began without warning, dulling the pavement into a muted shine. Claire paused beneath the overhang for a few seconds, breathing deeply, catching the scent of wet concrete blending with the faint perfume she still wore. Her shoulders were tight, her hands unusually stiff, clear signs that her body was responding late to an impact her mind had carried in silence. The man walking beside her noticed and asked, without pressing, whether she wanted to go straight to the car. Claire nodded briefly, no words needed, and they entered the waiting vehicle, the engine already running, honoring a silence that asked for neither commentary nor comfort. The car moved slowly, avoiding main roads, skirting bright avenues, passing through quieter sections of the city. Streetlights blurred through rain-streaked windows, casting long shadows inside. Claire rested her forehead against the cold glass for a moment and closed her eyes, and Jonathan's face surfaced without effort, still, unsettled, trying to pinpoint when control had slipped away. There was no satisfaction in the image, no urge for retaliation, only a strange emptiness, as if something that had occupied space for years had been removed all at once. For a long time, Claire had imagined the day he would realize his mistake. She pictured direct confrontations, composed speeches, sharp responses that would finally lift her above the humiliation. None of that happened. What arrived instead was silence, and that silence felt heavier now than any words spoken aloud. The car stopped in front of a discreet building, far from the city's central flow. Claire stepped out as the rain intensified, touching her face and hair, forming small pools on the ground. She walked toward the entrance unhurriedly, aware that the exhaustion she felt didn't come from her body, but from something deeper, from crossing a point of no return and needing to absorb it without shortcuts. Inside, the space was simple, softly lit, with light-colored furniture and very few objects. Nothing was designed to impress. Claire sat on the couch and stayed there for several minutes doing nothing. No phone, no scanning the room, allowing silence to exist without trying to fill it, something she hadn't allowed herself in a long time. The door opened quietly, and the woman overseeing the entire process stepped in, walking to a small table where she poured water into 2 glasses. She handed one to Claire and remarked softly that she had been more direct than some standards usually allowed. Claire held the glass with both hands and replied that softening had never been protection, only postponement. The woman nodded, noting that Jonathan hadn't expected such public exposure. Claire looked down at the water before answering that he had never expected her to take up space. Silence settled between them again, comfortable and unforced, requiring no further explanation. When asked if she was okay, Claire took a few seconds before answering that she was intact, but tired. The word felt honest, free of any attempt to appear strong or fragile. The woman offered no advice, no rehearsed reassurance. She simply stayed there, seated across from her, fully present. That presence was more comforting than any speech could have been. Hours later, Claire returned to the hotel. The room felt different this time, smaller, more real, perhaps because she was different now. She set her bag on the chair, kicked off her shoes, and walked to the window, watching rain trail down the glass in uneven lines, warping the city beyond while life continued as if nothing had happened. She sat on the bed and opened her bag, pulling out the old badge she still carried. She wasn't sure why, habit, perhaps, or the need to see it once more. She ran her fingers over the worn plastic, the printed name, the generic title, then placed the badge in the nightstand drawer, not as a dramatic gesture, but as a quiet closure to an identity she no longer needed to uphold. Her phone buzzed with a brief message saying she had revealed more than he expected. Claire read it and didn't reply right away, letting the weight of that realization settle slowly. Minutes later, another message arrived, warning that consequences would begin now. She locked the screen, not out of fear, but with the awareness that the road ahead would demand constant attention. She lay down without changing clothes, feeling her body take time to unwind while her mind replayed the meeting, Jonathan's expression, the exact instant everything shifted. There were no tears and no celebration, only absorption. The next morning, she woke early, took a long shower, letting hot water run over tense shoulders, then dressed carefully in comfortable, practical clothes. In the mirror, she noticed something small but significant. She no longer needed to adjust her posture to seem smaller. At the hotel breakfast, there were few people, low conversations, cups tapping saucers, the smell of warm bread, small details anchoring her to the present. When she returned to the room, she found an envelope slipped under the door. Inside was a handwritten note asking her to rest that day. Claire held the card for a moment, feeling something close to quiet gratitude, then sat back on the bed, understanding that this pause, rare and fragile, was part of the fall, not as defeat, but as the space required to carry everything that would come next. If this part resonated with you, consider supporting the channel with a super thanks or subscribing. Your support makes a real difference in helping us continue telling stories this intense. Claire Whitman didn't wake up to a different world the next morning. The hotel room looked the same, the light coming through the window carried the same soft tone, and the city outside moved at its usual hurried pace, indifferent to what had shifted inside her. The transformation didn't arrive with visible signs. It settled quietly and permanently. She got up without rushing, pulled the curtain fully open, and let the daylight fill the room. From above, she watched the buildings, the streets, the small figures below following routines they knew nothing about. For a long time, Claire had lived the same way, supporting systems without being seen, keeping things running without being acknowledged. The difference now was simple and profound. She knew exactly who she was. And that awareness changed everything, even when nothing appeared different. She had breakfast alone, unhurried, seated near the window. The old sense of constant urgency was gone, the need to prove herself, to stay alert, to avoid mistakes. The silence of that morning wasn't empty. It was presence. For the first time in years, She could simply exist without shrinking, without hiding. In the days that followed, life didn't become easier, and that mattered. There was no clean path forward, no ready-made answers, no comforting promise that everything was settled. What she gained was coherence. Decisions now came from a more grounded place. Each choice required responsibility, not approval. Claire began stepping into spaces she once avoided, not out of fear, but because she had learned not to make herself a priority. Now she entered, sat down, spoke when it mattered, and left when it made sense. Some people moved closer. Others drifted away. Over time, she understood that not every distance is a loss. Sometimes, it's simply the world rearranging itself when you stop carrying roles that were never yours. Jonathan Miller's name surfaced less than she expected. When it did, it felt diluted, lacking real weight, like a distant echo of something that no longer commanded her attention. He continued trying to maintain the image he had always built, but now with less reach and a smaller audience. Claire realized with calm clarity that some people only seem powerful as long as someone else agrees to stay small beside them. She didn't feel the need for revenge. She didn't need to prove anything. Existing outside that narrative was enough. And maybe that's why this story has held you until now. Maybe, at some point, you recognized yourself in it. Maybe you've been the one underestimated, the one told you weren't capable, that you weren't important, that you should be grateful for the little space you were given. Or maybe you were the one who failed to notice the quiet strength of someone nearby, mistaking silence for absence, calm for dependence. Stories like this aren't really about money, status, or power. They're about perception. About how often we realize too late that strength doesn't always announce itself, and that some people build while others simply occupy space. Claire didn't win because she changed environments or connected with powerful people. Those were outcomes, not causes. What truly changed was the place inside her from which she began to act. She stopped asking for permission to exist. She stopped accepting labels she never chose. She stopped holding on to silences that made her smaller. And if you stayed until the end, maybe you're living something similar, even in a completely different setting. At work. In a relationship. Within your own family. That constant feeling of needing to explain yourself too much, of adapting all the time, of swallowing words just to keep the peace. Claire's story doesn't promise an easy ending. It offers something more honest, the possibility of not abandoning yourself. Not every new beginning is loud. Some start the moment you stop folding inward. Some don't ask for applause, they ask for the courage to stand by choices not everyone will understand. And sometimes, that's already enough. Claire moves forward without absolute guarantees, but with something she never had before, alignment. And that changes how you walk, how you speak, how you choose. It even changes how you experience loss, because some things hurt less once you realize they were supporting a version of you that no longer fit. Now, speaking directly to you, if this story touched you, it's because it connected with something real inside you. And that matters. You're not overreacting. You're not weak for feeling. You're not alone for questioning the place you occupy in the world. Some stories don't arrive just to entertain. They arrive to keep you company. To sit beside you for a few minutes and say, without rehearsed speeches, that what you're feeling makes sense. Thank you for staying until the end. And I'll see you in the next video.